Franz's work for a number of years. He doesn't really need much of an introduction, but it wouldn't be very polite if you come all this way not to say a few nice words about him. And there are many nice words to say about him, but I will be brief. As well as releasing many records, contributing to numerous bands, and writing books, Franz has also taught at the University of California in Berkeley. He's taught at the University of Columbia, and he currently teaches at Bard University in New York State. His third book, And People, was published by the University of Texas Press last year, and Rolling Stone magazine named it as one of the most important and best music books of the year. In this book, Franz argues that to really understand what it means to be a band person, we have to get to grips not just with the craft and the art involved, but also to really understand how a celebrity culture forces people to the foreground, emphasizing band leadership and front people, at the expense of really understanding and appreciating creating music and other forms of art as a collective endeavour. And Franz really tells the story of that through the people that he gives voice to in what's actually, as we've been discussing this afternoon, a very ethnographic piece of work. We're very fortunate in this sense that Franz is going to be joined by Stephen Jakaitis. Amongst Stephen's many books is this wonderful tome, The Wages of Dreamwork, and I can highly recommend both of these books to you. This is published by Minor Compositions, also 2024. In this book, Stephen asks, what can we learn from the exploitation of passion, creativity, imagination? Oh, thanks, Philip. And no, it doesn't argue what can we learn from, thank you, Philip. He argues what can we learn from the exploitation of passion.
Second edition.
But we can learn all, I think, something valuable about Philip's good manners. Creativity and imagination in artistic work. And what Stephen really shows for us is what we can learn about how this happens in artistic work that really sheds light on what's happening across the labour market, across the rest of the workforce more generally, and it helps us to appreciate how cultural workers navigate the many tensions and demands of shaping their work that Franz also documents so beautifully. I've co-organised this discussion with Philip Hancock and with John Preston. Very grateful to them and for support from the Faculty of Social Sciences. So thank you so much, Franz, for joining us today and coming all this way to speak to us with a full schedule of gigs ahead of you over the next week or so. Thank you so much to Stephen. Thank you all for coming. The plan is for me to hand over to Franz to talk to you about his book and his work for probably about the first 20-25 minutes, then to hand over to Stephen as discussant, and then to open for questions and discussion with you. So thank you all very much in advance. As I'm sure you've heard many times before, Franz, take it away.
And I want to also thank John and Melissa and everyone for giving me this opportunity and bringing me over for this. I will keep this relatively brief, I think. The talk is centered around my book, which is Band People, Life and Work in Popular Music, which is an exploration of the artistic and interpersonal dynamics of that odd conglomerate of long-term artistic collaboration, friendship, small business, and chosen family that we call a rock band, which is maybe a slightly stranger institution than we sometimes give it credit for. It's an organization that's often formed by people who are too young to know what they're signing up for, which apparently has to be reinvented from scratch virtually every time, although following certain commonly understood scripts. I interviewed about 90 musicians for the project with various roles and levels of public notoriety. In addition to the interviews, I drew on studies of group dynamics and cohesiveness, hierarchies, both imposed and emergent, ethnographies of jazz and orchestral musicians, some sideman memoirs, some of the vast arrays of theorizing of cultural work and collective creativity, as a way of contextualizing the band experience in the larger context of thought about, for lack of a more sophisticated framing, how people deal with each other. Since I've been marinating in this material, both in the preparation of the book and in the book events in the fall when it came out, I'm willing and able to address and riff on any of the topics that are here. And the conversational model is I think it would be more productive anyway. So I'll present some general remarks, and then maybe we can take it from there in terms of what's interesting to everyone. I've had an afternoon-long conversation with Melissa and Casper, and that's gotten into some of this stuff already. But the first question I often have to answer is, what do you mean by band people? So maybe I'll start with a short excerpt from the introduction in which I try to lay that out. And the term is one that came out of the interviews. Part of the genesis of the project was trying to identify what this community was. I had the idea for the book, or the first germ of the idea for the book, at a period of time in my mid-30s when I had come off the road for the first time after 15 years of sort of ambition and trying to do one thing after another. My wife had started a tenure-track job, and we had a young child, and so I came off the road. It made sense for me to be the caregiver at home, and it was a little bit of an identity crisis because she was starting a new job. I was meeting her colleagues. They would say, as one does politely, so what do you do? And at that point, for the last 15 years of my adult life, I would have said with some pride, I'm a touring musician. I play in bands. But at that point, that wasn't true anymore, and it didn't seem like it was going to be true anytime soon. So it was a bit of an identity crisis, but of course, one of the flip sides of an identity crisis of that kind is that it's an opportunity for perspective, for jumping off that treadmill and pausing and saying, what is this thing that I've devoted the first part of my adult working life to, and who are the colleagues, and what are the guild skills of that group. But it wasn't quite clear what to call those people. Sideman is a term that comes up a lot, but that's unhelpfully gendered and a little bit didn't quite feel right either for people who are a piece of a collaborative project, as opposed to hired help for someone else's project. Bassist Jason Narducci said, I was sort of asking people as I interviewed them, what do you call that kind of people that we are? We recognize each other, but what are we? And he said, well, I just call us band people. Thank you. You've saved me a lot of work here. So here from the introduction. These then are the band people. Secret and not so secret weapons, side of the stagers, hired guns, prolific joiners and members of bands, rhythm and horn sections, backup singers, consiglieres, accompanists, and composers. Musicians not primarily known as front people, or popularly understood as the authors of the works in which they participate, but without whom these works would not exist. What sociologist Jason Toynbee calls social authorship, quote, the cumulative effect of small creative acts occurring across a social network of production, reveals itself both in musical effects like swing that require subtle, even unconscious input from every band member, but also in the essential identifying traits of individual musicians, their idiolect, which combine to create distinctive, often irreducible groups. Anecdotally, or in the conventional wisdom banks of music fandom, we can easily call up examples of bands whose special something disintegrated with the loss of one or more seemingly secondary members. What distinguishes band people from any other worker negotiating the contradictions, frustrations, and satisfactions of their job? In some ways, nothing. But there remains a fascination with the idea of a person who devotes their life to an ideal they adopted as a teenager, in which they have to adapt to the mutating challenges of adulthood. What percentages of people playing music at 16 or 18 are still playing at 26, or 38, or 65? How do the skills of the music world translate to the larger world, if at all? We're comfortable with the mythos of creativity unbound, but what does creativity bound look like? Creativity within parameters and restraints, if one chooses to be creative within those bounds at all. The narratives of band people are the statements of their worth and their understanding of their labor. You're interested in all the fraught places, said violinist Gene Cook when I explained the kind of book I wanted to write. To talk about the role of a band person is to talk about art and craft. It is to talk about the value of fame, about a celebrity culture that requires the singling out of individuals from a collaborative enterprise, that privileges beauty or proximity or narrative. It is to talk about the politics of cultural labor and the precarity that the working lives of musicians share with a growing segment of the larger economy. The pun on gig economy is almost too obvious to point out. It is to talk about the myth of the genius working in isolation and to uncover the wide pyramid of talent that supports that work, what sociologist Howard Becker calls the support personnel of the culture industry. It is to once again challenge the myth of meritocracy. Is it better to be the best player or the best hang? It is to talk about political dynamics and the ways in which social groups organize themselves. Autocracy, aristocracy, democracy. It is to talk about individual psychology. Everyone is the star of their own life, if not actually the star of their circumstances. It is to talk about freedom, the promiscuous freedom of relative anonymity versus the agency offered by fame. It is to taxonomize specialists and stylists, generalists and chameleons, hired guns and band members, road dogs and punch clock session players, the fan favorite and the quietly irreplaceable. Who are these band people, the character actors of popular music? Or as drummer R. Babajan put it, some nights I feel like a god, some nights I feel like an ambitious t-shirt salesman with entitlement issues. First and foremost, it's a question of how to talk about and how to credit collective creativity. Rock-adjacent music as a commercial product is inextricable from its marketing, and marketing requires a limited number of faces to sell as authors of the product. Becker, who's a primary text for this, uses the term art world to denote the network of people whose cooperative activity, organized via their joint knowledge of conventional means of doing things, produces the kind of artworks that the art world is noted for. It seems obvious to say that if everyone whose work contributes to the finished artwork does not do his or her part, the work will come out differently. But it is not obvious to pursue the implication that it then becomes a problem to decide which of all these people is the artist, while the others are only support personnel. It was obvious to him, he credited his years playing jazz piano, that the star system of the art marketplace obscured the necessity of support personnel, the craftspeople without whom the work could not be executed. Persistent narratives of this music, which reproduce tropes of lone Byronic genius, miss that it is in fact largely a product of careful craft practiced by groups of collaborators. Flaubert somewhat famously credited the man who brought him his coffee at 5:30 a.m. every morning with saying without that person the novels couldn't have been written. We can compare the music world in this way to the film world. We talk about a movie in terms of its director, right? A Steven Spielberg film. But we understand that hundreds of other people Steven Spielberg is not shooting, writing, editing, distributing the movie, right? Screenwriters, cinematographers, gaffers, and grips make it possible and contribute in all kinds of meaningful ways, which are, of course, backed by their unions and paid and credited. The difficulty of finding even basic album credits on streaming services speaks to the contrast. The Beatles documentary, Get Back, did me a tremendous favor in the process of writing the book, since it gave everyone who watched it, which in my world was almost everyone I knew, a template for theorizing the band relationship, and every band Rorschach onto which they could project their theories of hierarchy and collaboration. Were you a diligent striver, the group project overachiever who always showed up on time, nudging and cajoling your colleagues, desperately but futilely trying to avoid the tag control freak? Well, Paul is your guy. Do you believe in the ironic chaos energy artist? John, of course. More fruitfully for my project, which of the two models for other guy in the band did you approve? The resentful, sarcastic third wheel George, with his nose pressed against the window, separating him from the creative core, or sweet, supportive Ringo, sometimes sleepy, but always there to help and admire. One of the fascinating things about the hierarchies that dictate the amount of creative leash any given musician has is that they're not a given at the formation of the group. Right? A lot of these hierarchies are emergent. It's one thing to be a band leader casting and curating your collaborators, the personalities, both musical and psychological, that you want to be working with. In a lot of cases, though, like any long-term relationship, people change over years under various stresses. Bands form at one stage in their lives, and if they are lucky enough to be successful, continue through various different stages of both success and personality and addiction and ego, and those relationships create new hierarchies that weren't there at the beginning. And sometimes those hierarchies are imposed externally, right? So fans become a lot of times more attached to a particular lineup of musicians than maybe the musicians, or certainly the band leaders themselves may be. And that creates a kind of external pressure. Media and management find it easier to deal, for all kinds of reasons, with one or two people in the band. And that creates a kind of emergent hierarchy that may have nothing to do with the internal workings of the band. So a book like this is written for two audiences. One of which is the people from the community about whom it's written. Of course, you want other band people to see their experiences reflected. But also, there's another community of people who see the analogies between these creative challenges, dignities, indignities, the ways in which creative collaborations can be fruitful but also restrictive, and the ways you negotiate those challenges, and those of their own work. So my sister, who's a graphic designer who works for a corporate entity, said, "Oh, this is the same way that the dynamics work in my job." I spoke to another person who's an architect. Right, it's another one of these jobs where your training may be in a sort of abstract artistic bubble. But in the event, you have to work on teams, you have to work with engineers, you have to work with clients, and sort of negotiate those limitations on your individual creativity. So to that point, obviously, it's a book as much about cultural labor generally as it is about the contestably and increasingly less glamorous world of band people specifically. So maybe I'll pause there and bring Stephen in, and we can move to the Choose Your Own Adventure.
Well, there was certainly a lot of adventures to have here. A lot of interesting stories, a lot of background stuff, a lot of really funny stuff. Maybe I want to start from a beginning point. Is oftentimes I find people write books because of something happened to them that you're trying to understand.
Yeah.
And one of the things I want to start with is, how have you navigated these kind of boundaries? One of the main themes of the book is this sort of like difficult boundary between being a band member versus being a hired person, being external. But you've worked in a band, and you worked as a producer. I mean, for instance, thinking about your role in World Inferno, you're credited at times as part of the band, as a producer, or as a session player. So I'm guessing like you've had to like navigate that boundary multiple times.
I think most musicians do, right? The musicians for whom you only have one job with a clearly defined role over the course of a career are pretty few and far between. You know, maybe if you're a unionized orchestra member, right? You might have one job for a whole career, but for most of us, you're a freelancer, you have some situation where you're a band member who's part of the creative collaboration. You may be involved with another group for whom you're explicitly a hired gun, or you're working for someone else. You may have jobs where you're called in as essentially an hourly worker, right? But an hour to come in and play on someone's record, let's say. But an hourly worker who also has to negotiate the terms of the engagement, both financially, because there are, again, unless it's a union session, which are pretty few and far between, are always open for negotiation. But also the creative terms are always open for negotiation, right? You don't know necessarily going into a room like that how much leash you're going to have, or how much they want a straight down the middle sort of replacement level guitarist or keyboardist, or whether they're calling you to be you, right? These are two different kinds of musicians. The ones who are I talk about them as character actors, right? The Jeff Goldblum, who's your type of character actor, where you're hiring them to be themselves within the context, versus the disappear into a role, like Mark Rylance type.
Well, it's tricky because you could be in so many different positions and you're constantly negotiating that, but there's also the high level of informality. So how these things shift are probably always up for debate. You can always tell if you're, are you right here, am I here, which role am I in now? And
oftentimes, it's to your disadvantage to be more explicit about it, right? Because it's part of the social norms of rock bands discourages formality about that sort of thing, right? I talk a lot about this in the book, about the extent to which people privilege being a good hang, being cool, being not upsetting the social norms of backstage or the recording studio. And a lot of times that's coded, asking about money or talking explicitly about your role is coded uncool.
That's not fun, man.
It's not punk. It's Stuart Bogey in the book talks about the class dynamics of indie rock specifically, right? Indie rock is, people don't always talk about this, but where does indie rock come from? It used to be called college rock, right? At least in the States, and that's in a lot of ways a more accurate description, that it tends to be dominated by people from middle class, upper middle class, college educated. And Stewart talks about how that adds to this discomfort or sort of disdain for talking about money, because the people who are running the bands are often people who are not as concerned about making a living as Stewart is as a horn player, as a jobbing horn player coming in.
One of the things I really like about halfway through the book, at one point you say, sometimes the sort of taxonomy of different kinds of support musicians seems more like it's just an artifact of the role of copyright law and capitalism imposing upon itself onto the roles people have, more so than it actually being a sensible arrangement of ways to talk about these things. And I think that's a really compelling argument, but also a really kind of sad one, because I think it's probably just true, right?
But sorry, please.
But also then you start to talk about how copyright law has problems dealing with collective creativity, and it can't sort of deal with sort of things which are done collaboratively in terms of giving up roles of property.
Right. So this why copyright law specifically applies, and sorry if I'm saying something that's obvious to everyone, is that the way tends to be about songwriting royalties, right? The ownership of the intellectual property of songwriting. And that kind of copyright law developed in the UK and in America in a time where the assumption was professional songwriting teams and professional performers, and those, by and large, not being the same person, right? With some exceptions, your Noel Cowards and so on. But the idea of the classic team of someone who's writing the chords and the melody and another person who's writing the lyrics, and this is the norm well into what we would think of as the rock and roll era, basically until the mid-'60s, when the influence of the Beatles and the other British invasion bands for the first time introduces this idea of the rock band as a self-generating creative unit internally. the idea, the expectation, based on all these ideas of sort of primitivism and authenticity, that that they would be producing their own material, facing each other in a practice room. And the kinds of songs that can be copyrighted, which is basically essentially anything you can write down as sheet music, so chords, melody, lyrics, structurally excludes, for example, drummers, which may be a huge part of the creation of the song, but have no structural place in copyright law and the intellectual property of the creation of a rock band. And so that the ways in which copyright law is not an exact match onto the creative expectations of the rock band is something that resonates throughout the last 50 years. Adam Gopnik likes to say that the story of any band, read any band biography and about the ways bands disputes arise, and always come down to a question of publishing and songwriting royalties. So someone like Peter Buck from REM talks about how, and they're one of these bands that become a little bit, there are a couple bands that when you have this conversation with band people, they exert a particular fascination. U2, REM, Radiohead, because they're bands that decided to share their songwriting equally. And they decided early, before there was real money at stake, and they stuck to it. So everyone got rich at the same time and at the same speed, right? Because the importance of songwriting royalties is it's another income stream that's separate from playing shows and selling merchandise that only accrues to the people who have those credits, so oftentimes the singer and primary songwriter. And that's the thing that first creates a class division within a rock band. And Buckhead talks about that the reason he pushed for that in REM is because he had read band biographies and he saw that this was one of those stumbling blocks, along with addiction and ego, that he saw as recurring over and over again, and unlike those other ones, seemed easily avoidable. And the other thing you notice about those bands is that they have multi-decade careers with a noticeable lack of acrimony. I had something else to say, but I forgot. So,
well, the one distinction you really used, I think is quite interesting because it's easy to forget, is the difference between songwriting and arrangement, and how arrangement can be super, super important and actually really affect the song, but not be credited in that sort of legal sense. And one example you use, which I think is super interesting, is Herbie Flowers.
Yeah.
Herbie Flowers is the session musician who famously, the song "Walk on the Wild Side" by Lou Reed. In the beginning bass part, where you hear both the acoustic bass and the electric one, and it's doubled. It's interesting because he's played as a session player, right?
Yes.
And the interesting thing you say is he did the double part to get basically paid twice.
He got double scale because he did an overdub.
Yeah. which is funny, but what's also interesting about that is because he was a session player, he doesn't get any royalties. Now the layer on top of that is then A Tribe Called Quest in the 80s releases "Can I Kick It," which samples "Walk on the Wild Side," and then they get sued by Lou Reed, who gets 100% of the credits for that song, even though the part they sample had nothing to do with him. I mean, it's not his lyrics. It's probably, what we're talking about, like 3 notes, right? 2 notes
of the bass part.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so the songwriting is Lou Reed, based on a 3-chord song and the lyrics. The bass part is an arrangement that's come up with by this union, session player, British Musicians Union. Interestingly, so Herbie Flowers never expressed any resentment about this, because from his point of view, he got his session rate. It was one of many sessions he did, and the terms of the engagement were clear from the beginning.
Okay.
That's not the case in most rock bands, right? Because most rock bands don't understand how copyright works. Most rock bands haven't had those discussions about songwriting, and the terms of engagement in a rock band are often not talked about with any kind of explicitness before, on the formation of a rock band.
Not a good hang, man.
Not a good hang. So again, a lot of the people I talk to have their sort of iconic ideas of pieces of arrangement that they think of as crucial to the song. So John Worster talks about the drums on Lust for Life, or Brian Viglione talks about the trumpets on Ring of Fire. That these are crucial to the master recording. Now without getting too deep in the weeds, Herbie Flowers is eligible for royalties for radio play for Walk on the Wild Side in the UK, but not in the United States. The United States does not have a guaranteed radio performance royalty, which is something that musicians groups have been bringing to Congress since the 1940s, and because of the opposition of the National Association of Broadcasters and the Clear Channel Corporation, has never gone through.
I mean, I thought it was interesting the way in which the sampling almost like gave the credit to Lou Reed as a songwriter, even though what was actually being borrowed from was the arrangement.
Yeah.
But maybe I'll ask one more thing, and then we'll see. We'll sort of open it up. Recently, I was having a chat with Penny Rambeau from Crass, and the intent was I was going to sit down with him and talk to him about his role as a producer, because he's produced many albums. And the interesting thing is I thought we'd be discussing about like mic placement and how you work with artists. And I was like halfway, 2 hours in, and all of a sudden I realized you're basically talking about doing therapy and psychoanalysis with artists. For him, it was all about how you get people to go to a certain place, or how you get them out of their comfort zone. And one thing I tripped by reading is oftentimes the best hired hands are the ones who basically do something similar artistically. And there's much story with Shazan Ismaili.
Yeah.
The way that he almost does something which gets artists to do things they wouldn't do, but artistically. I'm just thinking that the dynamic of how the side musician or the support personnel tries to or makes possible for the lead artist to sort of do things or go to places they wouldn't have artistically without them, and how that role is valued.
Yeah, I think that, it makes me think of another anecdote from the book that connects this to the previous question, which is the way Glenn Kotche from Wilco talks about his relationship with Jeff Tweedy. So Jeff Tweedy is someone whose songs are pretty straightforward, but is in a position where he has assembled this cast of characters for the band who are coming from very different places. Glenn Kotche is from the contemporary composition and improvisation world. Nels Klein is from jazz and improvised music, and just sort of lets them have at the song, but then also credits them, right? So Glenn Kotche in a couple of situations has gotten songwriting credits for contributing a transformative drum part to a song, which that's up to the mercy of the songwriter if he wants to do that. But what that does for Tweedy in exchange for giving up some of his songwriting royalties is it incentivizes his band members to bring their creative selves to the project, knowing that they'll be rewarded for it, as opposed to a different kind of band leader might want just sort of a timekeeping drum part, or a drummer might be in a situation where they know they're not going to get a stake in the song, and so they would not go to the trouble of coming up with anything other than a timekeeping drum part. So there's sort of a mutual benefit in those situations.
Or you also have moments where the artist, the support personnel could bring more, but the artist just doesn't want that. Just play the beat.
And one of the core skills for band people is reading the room in that way, right? So there's a drummer who was featured in this book who has joined a new band recently. And on my book tour, I was talking to people who knew this drummer. And one of them had gone to see the drummer playing with that band recently, and said, I said, how did it sound? And he said, he sounded like a guitarist's idea of a drummer, which I took to mean, I'm being very diplomatic here, not naming names, because it's a band leader who's known for being really difficult on their support musicians. And so when I took this, and then I, literally 2 days later, I saw another person who said, oh yeah, I saw so-and-so playing. I can always tell like such a distinctive sound. I can always tell when it's that person playing. And that to me was really contradictory information, right? Because the first says to me, a guitarist's idea of the drummer is someone who's just reproducing what the songwriter wants, sort of like a metronomic drummer. And the other one is someone who has a really distinctive sound. But what that said to me is that this drummer was very good at knowing that they were working for a demanding songwriter, was just doing the beat, but in their own situations was capable of bringing a really distinctive sound.
Yeah, like you have stories of the drummers who joined a new band and then almost try to replicate the sound of the previous drummer to fit into and work with the previous style without moving it too far.
Sure. Well, that's a slightly different. That comes back to that question of fan expectations, right? So John Worster talks about joining Bob Mould and asking about whether he should try to recreate the drum parts from Husker Du records. And Bob Mould, of course, has no particular emotional attachment to those drum parts. Play whatever you want. But John talks about then being at a festival playing with Mould and seeing a fan up front air drumming the parts from the Husker Du records, and John wasn't playing those parts, and he felt so bad. He felt like he was letting that fan go.
Cool.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Can we open it to questions, comments from other people? Let's go first. Philip, and then who wants to go next? Okay, let's start with you.
Just an encounter like that last bit reminds me, the story with the Who, that one of the biggest sort of bones of contention between Townsend and Daltrey was when they took on Kenny Jones as the drummer, because Daltrey wanted somebody to play like Keith Moon, and Townsend wanted somebody just to keep time for the band. And as Townsend rightly said, for God's sake, nobody can play like Keith Moon. There's nobody going to try to attempt that. But that tension was actually quite palpable in the group for quite a long time. Jones was always seen as just a jobbing drummer.
Yeah.
So it was quite a significant part because of the riffs that took place. But just two questions, quite probably pedestrian questions, and I'm sorry I haven't read the book yet. It's coming around to me now. I'm next in the list, so I'm looking forward to it. But so you may talk about this, but I mean my first thought is, do any of the musicians you've spoken to, or generally speaking, does a kid pick up a drum kit or a guitar or whatever it might be with an ambition to being the kind of band person we're talking about, which I would probably describe as a jobbing musician? Or is the ambition always to perhaps initially be that front person, and that requires a re-identification as they go through their career? That's
across the board.
Yeah.
Some people, of course, are picking up picking up an instrument and imagining themselves as with the spotlight on them. But just as many are not. There are people, George Rush in the book and Peter Erskine both talk about going to see a Broadway show and being fascinated with the pit musicians and being like, I want to be that, and that pride of the idea of being the kind of person who could walk into any situation and fulfill the role and get the check. That there's something fun about that. I think the sort of psychological complications come in a couple ways. One of which is if you pick up, so Stuart Bogey talks about he started playing clarinet in elementary school as a 9-year-old, as you do, and you become a serious clarinet player. You make these choices as a kid. By the time he's a teenager, he's into hardcore and he wants to be in punk bands, but he's a clarinet player. There's no place for him. You're stuck with it at that point. He managed to join this Afrobeat band, which is a kind of, you're in a band, but the horn section is crucial to it, and then build off that to become a really valued indie rock, hired gun as a horn player. But on this fundamental level, you've chosen an instrument that's going to structurally exclude you from being part of the gang that you may have you may want to do. I mean, the other thing, and this comes up in sociological studies of orchestra musicians, is that every violinist in that section was trained to be a soloist, right? Came out, if you go to conservatory, that's the goal. But then, 98% of them are going to end up in a regional orchestra, second violin chair, and that's an adjustment you have to make too.
Time for just one more quick.
Go on then.
Just very quickly as well, the relationship between sort of the work that pays, I mean, is there a reflection or a consciousness of undertaking work that pays the bills, which then allows you to sort of play music that resonates with you, that you want to play amongst these kind of musicians, or is any gig a good gig, generally speaking?
It seems to me that, and this sort of goes to how musicians value themselves and how they think about what kind of money they're going to ask for in a certain situation, is that rock musicians, band people, right? So people, not just musicians, not just rock musicians, but rock musicians who, for whatever reason, have an attraction to this idea of being in a band, right? But musicians generally are idealists. It's a calling first before it's a profession. And some of that idealism retains, even no matter how cynical they get over the years. Want to say yes to things, and want to feel valued, and not to feel taken advantage of. And so they will. What the equation usually comes down to is that balancing the amount of money that they're being offered versus whether they feel. Well, let me put it this way. What Shahzad says in the introduction is the way he has started talking to people when they say, I want you to do my project. He says, I want you to go away. You have a better sense of your budget than I do. So I want you to take a quiet minute by yourself, think about the budget you have, and say, what is the most money I can offer Shahzad to do this project? And then I want to say yes to that number. Whether that's Damien Rice offering me $1,500 a day, or my buddy Joe, who's a janitor, who says, I really want you to do this, I think I can give you $60. That he wants to have the sense that he's being dealt with fairly, and so there's this quality of dignity about it. Some people will say, I'll take less money if I can bring more of my creative self to it. Some people will say, actually, you have to pay me more to do a job that anybody could do just because I'm not that interested in it. Everybody's got their own equation about it, but it is sort of this balance of dignity and, if not artistry, craftsmanship, respect for the craft.
Excellent, thank you.
Fascinating, thank you. Question over there, and Richard, and another question there. Thank you. So we've got 3 rounds up for us.
So apologies if you get to this, and I've only read the first couple of chapters. Do you think or talk about the role of the name of the band, and whether that's significant? So if you're Bruce Springsteen, the E Street Band, the Capable Baptistes, it's very clear that you've got a leader and a supporting band.
Yeah.
Or contrasting with some of the Waterboys, where Mike Scott sort of continually shapes and reshapes the band in his image, but it's not Mike Scott and the Waterboys, it is the Waterboys. Do you think that's significant in terms of people understanding their place in the hierarchy?
I think in those situations, everyone internally understands their place in the hierarchy. I think maybe externally it's not as clear, right? Bruce Springsteen and the E Street, they call him the boss. It's literally, right? It couldn't be more clear. I think it gets a little bit more murky in situations like the Waterboys, or like Wilco, or like Waxahachie, or these bands that they present as bands, but it's one person's essentially a solo project. Again, usually it's clearer on the inside maybe than it is on the outside. Can you name any of the other people in Waxahachie? I couldn't. Or if you replace them, cycling through band members. I think that's more of a marketing issue than anything else. I think it sort of suggests an interesting question about the state and the future of the rock band, in that there's much more pressure towards, all the incentives are away from forming rock bands in 2024, both from the difficulty, if you can, the better home recording technology gets, the easier it is to just make a record yourself. And you see that in the post-pandemic era, where many people are just making. And then you could hire a band. If people like the record, you can hire the band to go out on the road. And that's so much easier than trying to find a group of people that you get along with, trying to rent a rehearsal space, getting a van to get all the gear around. It seems to me anecdotally that to the extent to which guitar-based rock-adjacent music is still a major driver of culture, which is, I would say, very little. It's less about bands in the conventional sense and more about the solo project presented as a band.
Thank you. And then Richard.
So I suppose you're sort of mentioning various names of people, and it's almost the idea that they're not really that famous, that people won't know their names. But to me, I read about, mention various members of Superchunk or Kelly Hogan or Peter Hughes, whoever. To me, it's like a big deal. These are like big people. I'm just trying to work out whether something's changed. It might just be the fact that at Uberdorf I know all these people, but I don't know if it was part of the indie rock scene and the hardcore punk scene in the 90s particularly, that there was this sort of, maybe it was harder to find things out, but there was the zine culture, there was some kind of functioning music press, and that sort of you get attached to these people, these names, you'd follow them, you want to know what various members of Slint have gone on to do, or, you know, whoever's playing on a Will Oldham record, it kind of makes a difference. Whereas now, I don't know, you think you mentioned it briefly, the world of streaming, etc. Does anyone really give a shit who's playing this, or is it just sound?
I think it's easier to, if you're interested, it's easier to find out who those other people are. And the bass player might have more active Twitter than the singer, so you whatever, you get to know them a little more. When you were talking, it reminded me a little bit of the big band era, when a magazine like Downbeat would run a regular column called Sideman Switches, about, what horn player had moved from the Basie band to the Ellington band, and you could sort of track this. In the context of, we were talking about bands and orchestras and the where people see themselves versus where they end up. Jazz is a little bit different, right? Because jazz is a little more modular. You can be a leader on one session and a sideman on another session, and so the hierarchies are a little more mobile. Do people? I mean, I think there's just as many names in here that nobody would have heard of. I mean, why do you know Worcester probably because he's in a bunch of bands and he's a comedian too, right? Like people, but I don't know. I guess one of the categories of people that I was interested in talking to were the support musicians that you think of as unusually interesting or unusually transformative, or have a reputational capital within our circle of having that sort of special something. And so people like Worcester and Kelly Hogan are maybe like that. Peter Hughes, as sort of the other guy for so many years in the Mountain Goats, is sort of fascinating to talk to someone like that about how he conceptualizes that role. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer.
No, it is. Mountain Goats is a really interesting example because everyone knows it's one guy, but then it became a sort of band with sort of fairly prominent people in it.
Well, one of the interesting categories is that consigliere figure, right? The right-hand person. So Peter Hughes to John Darnielle, Mike Campbell to Tom Petty, James Bowman to Laura Jane Grayson Against Me, the person who's just made the role for themselves as the lieutenant, as the apparently egoless lieutenant, and how they think about that role Campbell is an object of fascination for a lot of the people I talk to, as someone who abandoned his nascent solo career because of his devotion to Petty, where other members of that band weren't necessarily able to adjust to a reality as Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers got bigger, that it was going to be Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers as opposed to a more democratic band, which it had been at the beginning. The drummer ends up leaving because he can't deal with that, and Campbell ends up saying, actually, you know what, I'm gonna be the guy who supports this guy.
What's your name band? Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Franz.
Sorry if you mentioned this in the book. I haven't got around to reading this. It's on the list. Very long list of books to read. I'm sure you can relate.
I'd say the nice thing about putting books out as opposed to putting out records out is that if someone's interested in a record and it comes out, they're probably going to consume and react to it in the first week or two. And so there's a nice long tail with the books where you get people years later finally saying, I got around to it, I love it. So it doesn't sink quite so quickly.
It's more commitment on the record as well.
Yeah, of course.
Time-wise. But it's like from your years of obviously experience and expertise, what would you say is the best way of dealing with clashing egos in a band?
Gosh, if anyone has solved that.
Like from your point of view, what would you say would be?
From my point of view, open lines of communication. I think one of the questions I've gotten about this book is people saying, my gosh, people are being so frank about their relationships with their band leaders. How did you get them to talk? I think, because by definition, I wanted to talk to people who were career band people. So I was going to be talking to people who were older, right? In band world, there's always this sort of constant upwelling of amateurs and semi-amateurs and semi-professionals who are going to, by the time they're 25, move on to the rest of their lives. I was always sort of by definition going to be talking to people who were older, who were 35 or more, and people who, again, also sort of by definition, had figured out, had been through some of this stuff. And so I think, if we're talking about people who've been working with the same group of collaborators for 10, 15, 20 years, they've probably already had that conversation. They're not going to be saying anything that their band leader doesn't know, right? And so I think part of that is about just maturity in the same way that communication in any relationship is about maturity. There's this cliche about a band is like a family, which is not exactly true. So one of the sources in the book points out, I think it's Dina Weinstein, says that bands that feature actual siblings never say that. But there is a way in which a band is like a long-term relationship, in the sense that they work better when you've learned how to talk to each other, and after you've gone through a couple life changes and managed to negotiate to keep the relationship going along with it. And so maybe why, if a young band can't negotiate their first relationship crisis, it's because they haven't had those conversations before.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Anyone else wishing to ask a question? Neil?
Really interesting talk, thank you very much. And you mentioned about the sort of external pressures on a band, or external, maybe we call them stakeholders or something, or like fans, you were talking about fans and their influence on, perhaps influencing and the hierarchy. And I don't know in the book if you get to talk about the manager, band manager or the record company. I understand there's been quite a lot of influence there in terms of shaping these situations. So I don't know if you've got anything, just a nugget of
Yeah, I did. I asked everyone if they dealt with management and how they used management, right? Because sometimes when management comes in, it's an opportunity to get an ostensibly neutral voice to triangulate between band members, whereas other bands would like to talk amongst themselves and then deliver a unified message to management to execute. And that depends on the different personalities and the way band gets run. Management is often used to only dealing with one or two people, or the expectation maybe is that it's just easier to get one or two people on the phone than to try to, how hard is it to schedule a conference call or a Zoom with 4 or 5 people? if you need a decision made quickly. So that can create an emergent hierarchy. Similarly with press, can you get everybody together for an interview? Does everybody want to be interviewed together? Is one person's voice going to dominate naturally? Do you have time and energy to interview people separately? Can you make a photo shoot where all 4 or 5 people have their eyes open, or is it easier to just take a picture of one person? Is it easier in the layout of a magazine article to just have 1 or 2 faces? There's all these other things that sort of come into play and start piling on to create these emergent hierarchies where maybe there weren't any before. I talked to Joe Lally from Fugazi, famously democratic band, fiercely democratic band internally. But who's the one person everybody knows from Fugazi? It's Ian Mackay. Right? There was the Hard Times, which is sort of the Onion for punk and for punk rock, ran the satirical website, ran a headline that said, Season 3 of the Serial Podcast to identify other members of Fugazi. And so if that band can't protect and defend their democracy to the external world, that just goes to show you how strong those pressures are.
Thank you. Anybody else want to? Can I just ask one final question to both of you? It's a bit of a cliche question, but I'm genuinely interested. Like, if we were having this conversation, say in 10 years, what do you think would be the key issues that we were talking about? Would it still be about money issues? Would it still be about recognition issues? Still be about band hierarchies and struggles and the push, whether it's from management or personalities, to come to the fore? You write a lot about visual artists and art collectives. Obviously, your focus is on musicians and band people. So, what do you think the kind of future of creative work is likely to be for workers in terms of their experience?
I think in terms of music, I think Franz is in some ways documenting a world which is kind of passing or has passed. Do you know Rick Beato?
Mm-mm.
He's this guy who makes these sort of old guy, yells at clouds kind of videos, but he was in the industry for a number of years, and he just wanted to do a video. He looked at sort of like top 10 albums over the past 40 years and how many were produced by bands versus solo artists. And it's gone from a very high percentage to almost nothing.
Yeah.
So I think we're seeing more of the emergence of a different kind of figure of the musician, which is more like the solo artist with, as you said, with sort of bought-in infrastructure. We also have figures of people who are musicians, but who also are streamers, content creators, who find other ways in which they sort of balance up different kinds of income, who work across different industries. So I think the band as a unit isn't nearly as prominent. We'll probably see more these different configurations of sort of what makes you write in music that will become much more prominent and have different sets of problems than bands per se. But that would be my guess.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I'm someone who's made my career and reputation in rock music, essentially, but I do think of it as essentially a legacy art form in the same way that jazz is a legacy art form. Jazz still gets made, rock still gets made, but it's not the primary driver of culture anymore. And I totally agree that all the incentives are for people. And if you look at the way, for example, Spotify markets itself to artists, the kind of artist that Spotify puts forward as here's the kind of artist that's going to succeed in the future that we imagine. It's never groups. It's always one entrepreneurial, bootstrapping creative who's attuned to their metrics on these various platforms and constantly responsive to digital feedback. As you say, that's the kind of music that you see represented.
But I think it's also interesting is you see forms of creativity take other models. For instance, a band I really like is a band called Polyphia. And one of the things they do is they draw a lot from almost, I'll call it trap hip-hop production methods in the way they play as a band. So they're taking sort of a different method of how you produce music, much more studio-based, and bringing it into a rock band format. And it's completely changing the way they sound, which sounds a bit like this. It's hard to describe. But I think the production methods changing will also change the music that is being produced.
Yeah, one of the ways that manifests, we were talking about this earlier, is that especially in the post-pandemic period when a lot of musicians have really upped their game in terms of home recording, a lot fewer records are getting made by bands playing together in a studio, and a lot more of them are getting made by someone doing parts here and then emailing them to someone else there and transforming them. And so, it's like a what's the thing where you draw something and fold the paper over and hand it to somebody else. And they
Exquisite
draw-
Corpse.
Exquisite Corpse. It's more of an Exquisite Corpse style of making records, which can manifest in sort of unpredictable ways. So, like, if someone I don't know is sending me a record to play on, I'm likely to be much more conservative in what I do on it, because I don't want to wait. If we're in a room together and I can watch their face, if I do some color outside the lines a little bit, I know whether they want me to do more of that or whether they want me to play more straight down the middle. But if they're sending me an entire record's worth of music to play on, I don't want to waste their time and mine by doing something they're going to send back to me. So I'm much more likely to play it straight down the middle. On the other hand, if I'm working with people that I know well, that I have a sort of creative comfort with, and I know that I have a long leash to try stuff, working by myself in isolation, without the clock ticking, without other people staring at me, gives me a little more leash to do something off the wall, because as a proof of concept. Because I've got a little more time on my own to fully flesh out that idea and say, I know this sounds crazy, but here's how I imagine it. So, it depends on your relationship with the person that you're working with in those contexts.
I'll give you one more about an interesting project. I have some friends in a band called Senyawa from Indonesia who are like doom folk experimentalists. They put an album which was put out by 44 record labels at the same time. So this sort of like the ability to sort of do a sort of like global collaboration is I think could create interesting possibilities of ways that I couldn't have thought of 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It's really interesting because what you both said contains glimmers of hope and optimism, but only glimmers.
I was trying to be a little hopey.
Yeah, you were hopey.
Well, I mean, one of the things, maybe this is a way to sum it all up, is that the history of the recorded music era, right? Music as a kind of industrial production, is this series of confrontations with technological disruption that eliminates a lot of musical jobs, that makes music accessible to a lot of other people. So it's this double-sided coin thing. People do continue, and each time it's sort of presented as an existential threat to music. But in each case, going from the player piano up through AI, that music still gets made, but it is always transformed in these unpredictable ways. But it disrupts people's income streams, but it makes them available to other people. It's existential on the individual level, not the industrial level.
Thank you so much. Anybody got any very final points they want to make? Franz literally flew in from Heathrow this morning, to Heathrow this morning, so I think